This is a story of how a single act of defiance in the dusty heart of the West could rewrite the fate of a forgotten people. All because a lone cowboy saw not cargo, but a soul. The ending will change how you see the meaning of honor. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below, and consider subscribing to join our community of story lovers as we unfold this tale. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Texas Panhandle, beating the dust into a fine, choking powder that coated everything in a layer of rust-red grit. It clung to the sweat on Caleb's brow and worked its way into the cracked leather of his saddle. He'd been tracking the prison wagon for 2 days, a grim black box on wheels that crawled across the horizon like a beetle of ill omen. He wasn't a lawman, nor a bounty hunter. His reasons were his own, etched into his conscience like a brand. Inside that wagon was a debt he had to pay. As he crested a low butte, he saw it, stopped by a shallow, muddy creek. The driver, a hulking man with a greasy beard, was watering the horses. But it was the man beside him who held Caleb's attention. Silas Blackwood, a name that tasted like bile and old blood. Blackwood was a vulture in human form, with eyes that missed nothing and a heart that felt even less. He specialized in fugitive retrieval, a clean term for a dirty business that often blurred the lines between law and predation. And there, tethered to the rear of the wagon with a thick rope, was the reason for Caleb's pursuit. A native girl. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, her dark hair matted with dust, her deerskin dress torn. Her hands were bound so tightly the rope had chafed her wrists raw. She stood with a defiant stillness that seemed to infuriate Blackwood, who was pacing before her. He saw her as rare cargo, a profitable piece of property. Caleb saw the fire in her eyes, a flickering ember of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. It was a look he recognized, a look he'd seen in the mirror on his worst nights. He spurred his horse, Colt, into a slow, deliberate walk down the slope. He didn't draw his gun. Not yet. The element of surprise was the only advantage he had against 2 armed men. "That's far enough, stranger." The wagon driver grunted, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. Caleb reined in his horse a dozen yards away. He ignored the driver, his gaze fixed on Blackwood. Silas. Blackwood's thin lips curled into a semblance of a smile. It didn't reach his cold, reptilian eyes. "Caleb, to what do I owe the displeasure? If you're looking for a cut, you're too late. This one's claimed." He gestured with his thumb toward the girl. "Got a fat bounty on her from the territorial marshal, inciting unrest, resisting federal authority. The usual lies." Caleb's eyes flickered to the girl. Ilara. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, he saw not defiance, but a flicker of searching curiosity. "I'm not here for a cut," Caleb said, his voice low and steady, carrying easily in the still hot air. "I'm here for her." Blackwood let out a dry, rattling laugh. "You've been out in the sun too long. Son, this ain't a stray calf you can claim. This is official business. She's not your property. Silas, let her go." "Or what?" Blackwood sneered, taking a step forward. "You'll shoot me? In front of a witness? You'll be a wanted man from here to the territories." "There are worse things to be," Caleb replied, his hand now hovering over the worn grip of his Colt peacemaker. He remembered the promise he'd made to a dying man, a Cheyenne elder who had saved him from a winter blizzard years ago. "Repay my kindness not to me, but to my people. Protect the flame from the wind." He saw the elder's daughter in this girl's eyes. He saw the flame. The wind was Silas Blackwood. The standoff stretched, thick and heavy as the heat. The girl, Ilara, never took her eyes off Caleb. She watched his hands, his face, the subtle shift of his weight in the saddle. She was reading him, gauging his intent, his resolve. She'd seen men like Blackwood her entire life. But this man, this quiet, sun-scorched cowboy, he was different. He didn't look at her with greed or contempt. He looked at her like he was looking at an equal. It was Blackwood who broke the silence, his patience finally snapping. "Enough of this foolishness. Get him, Hank." The driver, Hank, drew his gun, but Caleb was faster. He wasn't a gunslinger by trade, but he was a survivor. His Colt cleared the holster in a single fluid motion. A shot cracked the air, not aimed at Hank, but at the ground by his feet. The driver yelped and stumbled back, his own shot going wide. In that split second of distraction, Caleb kicked his horse forward, closing the distance. He didn't charge Blackwood. He charged the wagon. With another precise shot, he shattered the thick wooden lockbox where Blackwood likely kept his papers and money. Greed was a powerful motivator, and for a man like Silas, the potential loss of profit was a greater insult than a threat to his life. As Blackwood instinctively spun toward the splintered box, Caleb leaned low from his saddle. He drew his bowie knife and, with a single upward slash, severed the thick rope binding the girl to the wagon. "Go!" he yelled, not at her, but to her. "Run." For a heartbeat, she stared at him, her dark eyes wide with disbelief. Then, the flicker of fire ignited into a blaze. She didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted, not aimlessly into the plains, but toward the rocky, broken terrain to the east, a landscape that offered cover and confusion. Blackwood whirled back, his face a mask of fury, raising his rifle. But Caleb was already there, positioning his own horse, Colt, between the bounty hunter and the fleeing girl. He had become a living shield. "You just signed your death warrant, boy," Blackwood roared, his voice cracking with rage. Caleb didn't answer. He fired another shot, this one aimed at the wagon's front axle, splintering the wood. It wouldn't stop them for long. But he didn't need long. He just needed a head start. He pulled on Colt's reins, turning the horse to follow the path the girl had taken. He glanced back once, seeing Blackwood and his driver scrambling to assess the damage. They would be coming. He knew that with a certainty that chilled him despite the oppressive heat. He had paid the first installment on his debt of honor. But the cost was to be paid in dust and blood across hundreds of miles of unforgiving wilderness, with a girl whose name he didn't even know, and a past that was about to catch up with them both. The flight was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Caleb pushed his horse hard, his eyes scanning the broken land ahead for any sign of Alara. He found her not far off, crouched behind a cluster of sun-bleached boulders, her breathing ragged but controlled. She watched him approach, her body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt again. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "They'll be on us soon," he said, his voice raspy from the dust. "We need to move, and move smart." She said nothing. Her gaze was fixed on him, a mixture of suspicion and assessment. She studied the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his hand rested near his pistol, not with aggression, but with a weary familiarity. He offered her his canteen. She hesitated for a moment, then took it, drinking sparingly before handing it back. It was a transaction, not an acceptance of friendship, a fragile truce born of shared necessity. For the rest of the day, they moved east, into the labyrinthine canyons and mesas of the Badlands. Alara led the way on foot with an unnerving stamina, her movements fluid and sure-footed. She knew this land. It was in her blood. Caleb followed on horseback, his respect for her growing with every mile. She was no damsel in distress. She was a survivor. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, the air grew heavy and still. The temperature dropped, and a low, ominous rumble echoed from the horizon. Caleb looked up at the bruised-looking clouds massing in the west. "Storm's coming," he muttered. "A bad one." Ilara paused, sniffing the air like an animal. She nodded, her eyes scanning the rock formations around them. "This way," she said, her voice quiet, the first words she had spoken to him directly. She pointed toward a dark fissure in a sheer cliff face, an opening almost invisible from a distance. They reached it just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, quickly turning into a torrential downpour. The wind howled through the canyons, a mournful, angry sound. Inside the crevice was a small cave, barely large enough for them and the horse. It was dry and shielded from the worst of the wind. The storm raged outside, a symphony of chaos that sealed them in their small sanctuary. The enforced proximity was a palpable thing, a tension that filled the tight space. To break it, Caleb set about building a fire. He used the small hatchet from his saddlebag to shave dry wood from the core of a dead branch he found in the cave. Soon, a small crackling fire pushed back the damp chill and the encroaching darkness. Its flickering light danced on the cave walls and on Ilara's face, softening the hard lines of her defiance. She sat huddled on the far side of the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees. Caleb noticed she kept rubbing her wrists, wincing slightly. In the firelight, he could see the angry red welts left by Blackwood's rope, some of them rubbed raw and bleeding. Without a word, he rummaged in his saddlebags and pulled out a small tin of salve. It was a simple mixture of comfrey and beeswax, something his own mother had taught him to make. He uncapped it and held it out to her. She looked from the tin to his face, her eyes questioning. "For your wrists," he said softly. "It'll help." She watched him for a long moment, a silent battle playing out in her expression. Trust was a currency she couldn't afford to spend, but the quiet sincerity in his eyes, the simple practical gesture of kindness, seemed to sway her. She slowly, hesitantly, reached out and took the tin. She applied the salve to her raw skin, her movements careful and deliberate. The silence returned, but it was different now. Less sharp, less hostile. The shared warmth of the fire, the simple act of care, had begun to thaw the ice between them. Caleb leaned back against his saddle, the leather creaking softly. The storm outside mirrored the one inside him, the tempest of his past. He found himself staring into the flames, remembering the blizzard, the kindness of the Cheyenne elder, the promise he had made. He had failed to protect that man's family from sickness, from the encroaching world of the white man. This felt like a second chance. Atonement. He glanced at Ilara and saw that she was watching him again. This time, there was something else in her gaze. A question, as if sensing his thoughts. She finally spoke again, her voice a low murmur beneath the howl of the wind. Why? Caleb knew what she was asking. Why him? Why risk his life for a stranger? He owed her an answer, but the truth was a tangled, painful thing. "I owed a debt," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To a man who saved my life once. He asked me to look out for his people." She tilted her head. "You knew my father?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, at the shape of her eyes, the proud set of her jaw. He saw the resemblance now. The elder he knew, Chief Kenai of the Scattered Water Band, had spoken of a daughter taken by marshals years ago, a daughter he thought was lost forever. "Your father? Was Kenai?" he asked, his heart pounding. Ilara nodded slowly, a deep sadness filling her eyes. He walked the Spirit Road 2 winters ago. The weight of his failure crashed down on Caleb. He hadn't just failed to protect Kenai's people. He had failed to protect Kenai's own daughter. The scar on his soul, the one that drove him, felt like it had been ripped open anew. He looked at Ilara, at the raw wounds on her wrists, and saw a reflection of the wounds he carried within. They were two strangers, trapped by a desert storm, but bound by a shared history of loss they were only just beginning to understand. The fire crackled between them, a small beacon of hope in a vast darkness, illuminating the scars, both seen and unseen, that would forever connect them. The storm passed by morning, leaving the air washed clean and the desert floor damp and fragrant with the scent of sage and creosote. They left the cave and continued their journey east, the unspoken revelation of the previous night hanging between them. The knowledge that Caleb had known her father changed everything. It reframed his act of rescue from a moment of random mercy to a deeply personal obligation. For Alara, it meant this man was not a complete stranger, but a link to the life she had lost, a man bound by a promise to the father she mourned. The mistrust was still there, a low wall between them, but now it had a gate. Their progress was slow, the land was harsh, and they had to be careful. Blackwood was not a man to give up. Caleb knew his type. Silas's pride was as big as his greed. Being bested and robbed would fuel a relentless, obsessive pursuit. He would not just be hunting them for the bounty anymore. He would be hunting them for revenge. Ilara's knowledge of the terrain was their greatest asset. She led them through forgotten game trails and dry washes that hid their tracks, her senses preternaturally sharp. She could spot a circling hawk miles away and know if it was hunting prey or observing them. After 3 days of hard travel, their supplies were running dangerously low. Caleb knew they needed to risk finding a settlement. "There's a place," he said, pointing toward a distant smudge on the horizon. "An old mining town, mostly abandoned. It's called Purgatory's End. We might find supplies there, maybe a fresh horse." Ilara looked skeptical. "A ghost town?" "Sometimes ghosts are the best neighbors," Caleb replied grimly. Purgatory's End was aptly named. It was a collection of skeletal buildings bleached gray by the sun, their windows like vacant eyes. A single rickety sign for a general store swung on one hinge, creaking a mournful rhythm in the breeze. The place felt dead, but a wisp of smoke curling from a stone chimney in what looked like the old smithy told them it wasn't entirely empty. They approached with caution, leaving Colt hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. The smithy was occupied by a grizzled old prospector named Jed, a man whose mind was as scrambled as the eggs he was frying over his forge. He was half deaf, half blind, and wholly unconcerned with the world outside his small, cluttered existence. For a few silver dollars, he was happy to sell them a sack of flour, some dried jerky, and a bag of oats for the horse. While Caleb bartered with Jed, Ilara explored the ghost town. Her warrior instincts were on high alert. Something felt wrong. She moved with silent grace through the abandoned buildings, her eyes catching details Caleb might have missed. In the dust outside the old saloon, she saw it. A single, distinctive boot print. It was large, with a worn-down heel and a small V-shaped nick in the sole. She had seen that boot before. It belonged to Hank, Blackwood's portly driver. Her blood ran cold. They weren't behind them. They were ahead. She raced back to the smithy just as Caleb was strapping the supplies to his saddle. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "Or they were. I found a track." Caleb's face hardened. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "Where?" Suddenly, the smithy's single door burst open. It wasn't Blackwood. It was Jed, the old prospector, his eyes wide with terror. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the front of his shirt. He stumbled forward and collapsed, revealing Silas Blackwood standing in the doorway behind him, a smoking pistol in his hand. Hank stood just behind him, looking nervous. "Dropping in on old friends, Caleb?" Silas sneered, his cold eyes glittering. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble and expense. He kicked Jed's body aside with casual cruelty. But this old fool was surprisingly informative before he expired. Told me all about the princess he sold supplies to. Caleb pushed Alara behind him, raising his rifle. "It's over, Silas. Leave us be." Blackwood laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "Over? It's just beginning. You see, I did some digging after you interfered. The bounty on her is just pocket change. The real prize is what she protects. Or rather, what she is the key to." He took a step into the smithy, his movement slow and deliberate, like a snake cornering its prey. "I'm not just a bounty hunter. Caleb, I'm a collector of rare things. And the legend of the Awani treasure. Now that is the rarest thing of all." Alara stiffened behind Caleb. The Awani. Her people. Her breath caught in her throat. How could this man know that name? "They say," Blackwood continued, savoring each word, "that when the Awani tribe vanished, they left behind a garden of stone, a hidden valley where they stored generations of wealth, not just gold, but artifacts, sacred objects, and they say the way to find it isn't on a map. It's in the bloodline of their last royal heir. It's in her." He pointed his pistol directly at Alara. "She's not a fugitive. Caleb, she's a map. And now that I have you both cornered, she's going to lead me right to it." The vulture's mark wasn't just on her bounty poster. It was on her very existence, and in the desolate quiet of a ghost town. Caleb and Alara realized they weren't just running from a man. They were running from an obsession that would desecrate a people's most sacred secret for a chest of gold. The air in the smithy was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the suffocating weight of Blackwood's revelation. For a moment, no one moved. Caleb stood as a shield before Alara, his rifle steady, his mind racing. Blackwood had 2 guns on them. The tactical advantage. A direct firefight was suicide. But Alara was no longer just the person he was protecting. She was the mission. "The Awani are a myth," Alara said from behind Caleb, her voice ringing with a cold authority that surprised them both. It was a bluff, a desperate attempt to sow doubt. Blackwood's smile widened. "Myths are just truths that have been forgotten by most. Princess, I am not most people." He gestured with his pistol. "Drop the rifle. Caleb, slowly. Or the girl's map gets a new, permanent landmark right between the eyes." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew Silas was not bluffing. With painstaking slowness, he lowered his rifle and let it fall to the dusty floor. Hank scurried forward to retrieve it. The moment the rifle was out of his hands, Caleb acted. He kicked over the heavy anvil near the forge, sending it crashing to the ground with a deafening clang. It wasn't an attack, but a diversion. In the instant that Blackwood and Hank flinched at the noise, Caleb grabbed Alara's hand. "The back." He shoved her toward a small, grime-covered window at the rear of the smithy. It was a tight fit, but it was their only way out. Alara scrambled through, her movements agile and swift. Caleb followed, tumbling out into the alley behind the building, just as a bullet from Blackwood's pistol splintered the window frame where his head had been. They didn't stop to breathe. They ran, zigzagging between the derelict buildings, making for the cottonwood grove where Colt was hidden. Shots rang out behind them, kicking up dust at their heels. They reached the horse, breathless and hearts hammering. "He knows," Alara panted as Caleb swung into the saddle and pulled her up behind him. "He knows the name of my people. We'll lose him," Caleb said, his voice a grim promise. He urged Colt into a gallop, not back the way they came, but deeper into the uncharted territory to the east. The ghost town and the men in it shrank behind them. For hours they rode, pushing the horse, pushing themselves. When they finally found a secluded arroyo to rest, the sun was setting. The immediate danger had passed. But the new reality of their situation settled upon them. Blackwood wasn't just chasing a bounty. He was chasing a legend, and he believed Ilara was the living key. That night, under a blanket of stars so bright they seemed to hum, Ilara finally spoke of her home. "The Awani are not a myth," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of pride and sorrow. "We are not lost. We are hidden. We chose to disappear from your world when it brought nothing but broken promises and disease." She told him of the sacred valley, a place called Awani, which meant deep, grassy valley in her language. It was nestled in a remote, inaccessible part of the mountains, protected by natural rock formations that made it nearly impossible to find by chance. She was born there, a princess, the daughter of the chief. She explained that she hadn't been captured inciting unrest. She had left the valley on a sacred quest, a hunapo, to retrieve seeds from a rare medicinal plant that only grew hundreds of miles away, a plant their elders needed to combat a new sickness. It was on her journey home that she had been wrongfully identified and captured. "The treasure Blackwood speaks of," she continued, a sad smile touching her lips, "is not gold. It is our life, our culture, our history, carved into story stones. To him, they are curiosities to be sold. To us, they are our soul." Caleb listened, the vastness of his ignorance laid bare. He had seen her as a victim to be saved, a debt to be repaid. He saw now that she was a leader, a guardian of her people, with a burden far heavier than his own. His quest for atonement suddenly felt small next to her fight for her people's survival. "I can't lead you back to the trail," she said, her gaze turning serious, meeting his in the darkness. "Blackwood is a tracker. He will follow our path. But I can lead us home, the old way." From that moment on, their roles reversed. It was no longer Caleb guiding their escape. It was Ilara. She took the reins, both literally and figuratively. She navigated not by maps or trails, but by the sun, the stars, the subtle language of the land itself. She led them away from the flatlands and into a realm of towering red rock and winding slot canyons, a world that was both beautiful and deadly. She showed him how to find water seeping from rock faces, how to identify edible plants, how to read the signs of the earth that a white man's eyes would never see. He watched her, mesmerized. He saw the princess she was, not in title, but in her deep, unshakable connection to her world. She moved through the harsh landscape, not as an intruder, but as a part of it. Her ancestral knowledge was a map far more reliable than any piece of paper. The journey was perilous. They scaled cliffs, navigated treacherous ledges, and endured the blistering heat and freezing nights. But with every step, Caleb felt they were not just fleeing, but being guided. They were leaving his world of dust and violence and entering hers, a sacred geography whispered down through generations. He was following her now, not just to save her life, but because he was beginning to believe that her path, the path to the hidden sanctuary of the Awani, was the only place in this broken world where either of them might truly find salvation. Their journey through the high desert became a crucible, burning away the last of their reservations about each other. Ilara's leadership was quiet, but absolute. She read the land like a book written in a language only she knew. And Caleb, a man used to being self-reliant, found a strange peace in trusting her completely. He saw the weight of her responsibility in the determined set of her jaw and the focus in her eyes. He was no longer just her protector. He was her sworn shield, a role he accepted with a gravity that settled deep in his bones. They came to a river, a churning brown torrent swollen with snowmelt from the distant mountains. It was far wider and faster than Caleb had anticipated. It sliced through the canyon, a formidable barrier between them and the mountain range on the other side, the range that held the hidden entrance to Awani. There was no bridge, no shallow ford. "We have to cross," Ilara stated, her gaze fixed on the opposite bank. "The way around would take weeks. We don't have weeks." Caleb studied the current, the debris of branches and logs that were swept along in its powerful grasp. "It's too strong, Ilara. Colt can't make it with both of us. Not in that." "Then we cross without him," she replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. She began to uncinch the saddle, her movements practical and efficient. A profound sadness hit Caleb as he stripped the saddle and bags from Colt. The horse had been his only companion for years, a silent witness to his lonely pilgrimage. He slapped the horse's flank, sending him galloping back the way they came, a bid for his freedom. It felt like cutting off a part of himself. Now, they were truly alone. They secured their meager supplies in a tight bundle of oilcloth. Ilara found a spot where a massive, fallen ponderosa pine stretched partway into the river. The plan was to use it to get past the most violent currents near the bank, then swim the remaining distance. It was a desperate gamble. The water was ice cold, a shock that stole the breath. They clung to the log, the current pulling at them, trying to rip them away. They made it to the end of the tree and launched themselves into the main channel. The force was immense, far stronger than it looked. It tumbled them, separated them. Caleb fought to keep his head above the surface, his waterlogged clothes dragging him down like an anchor. He saw Ilara, a dozen yards downstream, swimming with a powerful, efficient stroke that was clearly more practiced than his own. She was making progress. He was not. A submerged log, unseen in the muddy water, slammed into his side. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his ribs. He gasped, swallowing a mouthful of gritty water. His strength gave out. The current took him, pulling him under. The world became a swirling chaos of brown and green. His lungs burned. The ghosts of his past swirled in the dark water with him. The face of Chief Kenai, the faces of his family. He couldn't save. So this is it, he thought with a strange sense of calm. This is where my atonement ends, in failure. Suddenly, a hand gripped his hair, pulling his head above the water with ferocious strength. He coughed and sputtered, gasping for air. It was Ilara. She had swum back for him. Her face was a mask of fierce determination, her own exhaustion forgotten. "Do not die on me, Caleb!" she yelled over the roar of the water. "You promised!" She hooked her arm under his, fighting the current for both of them. Her strength was incredible, born of a life lived in the wild. She was no princess in a tower. She was a warrior. She towed him, inch by agonizing inch, toward the far bank. They collapsed on a gravelly shore, shivering and exhausted, an eternity from where they started. Caleb lay on his back, gasping, the pain in his ribs a sharp, throbbing fire. He was sure they were broken. Ilara knelt over him, her dark hair dripping water onto his face. Her touch was gentle as she felt his side, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. "You are a fool," she said. But there was no heat in her words, only a deep, resonant emotion he couldn't quite name. They found shelter in a small alcove of rock as the sun began to set, building a fire to ward off the life-threatening chill. The near-death experience had stripped away Caleb's final defenses. Lying there, wrapped in his single dry blanket, watching her tend to the fire, the truth of his past spilled out of him. He told her everything. He told her about being a young soldier, barely a man, filled with ideals that shattered when he was ordered to participate in the forced relocation of a peaceful village. He told her how he deserted, horrified by the cruelty he had witnessed. He told her how he had wandered for years, lost, until he collapsed in a blizzard and was found by Kenai. The chief had taken him in, healed him, and taught him the ways of the land, never once asking about the blue coat he had buried. Caleb had sworn to repay him, but when he returned to Kenai's band a year later with medicine and supplies, he found them decimated by a fever brought by settlers. He had been too late. "My debt to your father wasn't just for saving my life," Caleb confessed, his voice thick with a guilt that had shadowed him for years. "It was for everything I couldn't undo, for the world I came from, and the destruction it caused." He finally looked at her, his soul bared. "When I saw you tied to that wagon, I saw a chance to finally keep a promise." Ilara listened in silence, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. The river had been a baptism, washing away secrets and doubts. He was no longer just a man paying a debt. She had saved his life, just as her father had. Their fates were now inextricably, profoundly intertwined. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. It was not a gesture of pity, but of understanding, of shared loss and a shared future. On that shore, by the fire, a cowboy's confession met a princess's compassion. An unbreakable bond was forged, not in a promise made to the dead, but in a living commitment to each other, a commitment to see the journey through, together. With Caleb's ribs tightly bound with strips of cloth from his shirt, their progress slowed. Every step was an agony for him, but he refused to complain, his quiet stoicism a testament to his resolve. Ilara supported him, her smaller frame surprisingly strong, and her knowledge of healing plants helped ease the worst of his pain. She made a poultice of willow bark that dulled the ache, and found a fungus that acted as a potent anti-inflammatory. The bond forged at the river deepened with every shared hardship. The lines of rescuer and rescued had blurred completely. Now, they were simply two halves of a single purpose. After several more days of grueling travel through the foothills, Ilara stopped. "We are here," she whispered, her voice filled with reverence. Caleb looked around. He saw nothing but a massive wall of sheer granite, a seemingly impassable cliff face that stretched for miles in either direction. There was no valley, no entrance. "Where?" he asked, leaning heavily on a walking stick she had fashioned for him. Ilara smiled faintly. She led him to a specific section of the cliff, a place that looked no different from the rest. She pointed to a series of weathered, almost invisible handholds and footholds carved into the rock, ascending in a near vertical line. "The entrance is not for our enemies. It is for our people." She began to climb, her movements as certain and fluid as if she were walking on level ground. Caleb followed, his broken ribs screaming in protest with every upward pull, his determination the only thing keeping him from falling. The climb led them to a narrow ledge, hidden from below, that snaked around a buttress of rock. And then, he saw it. The ledge opened into a narrow, tunnel-like passage, a natural fissure in the mountain that had been widened by generations of Awani. They walked through the cool darkness of the passage for 100 yards, and when they emerged into the light on the other side, Caleb's breath caught in his throat. It was Awani, a perfect, hidden valley, cradled in a bowl of towering granite peaks. A crystal-clear river, the same one they had nearly died in, snaked peacefully through a meadow of impossibly green grass. Waterfalls cascaded down the cliffs, feeding the river and creating a gentle, constant mist that hung in the air. Small, elegant dwellings made of wood and stone were nestled amongst ancient groves of aspen and pine. It was a garden of stone, a paradise untouched by the harsh world outside. The air was clean, the silence profound, broken only by the sound of water and birdsong. An old man, seeing them emerge, let out a joyful cry. Soon, dozens of people, the last of the Awani, were running to greet them, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. They swarmed around Ilara, touching her, speaking her name, their love for their princess radiant. For 3 days, Caleb rested and healed while the Awani celebrated the return of their princess. He was treated with a gentle, cautious kindness. He was an outsider, but he was the man who had brought Ilara home. He watched her, no longer the weary fugitive, but a confident and beloved leader, consulting with the elders, comforting her people. He saw the treasure Blackwood was hunting. It was in the laughter of the children, the wisdom in the elders' faces, the intricate carvings on the story stones that lined the central plaza. It was a living, breathing history, and the thought of a man like Blackwood desecrating this sanctuary filled him with a cold fury. On the 4th evening, as Caleb was sitting with an elder named Teo, learning the history of a particular story stone, a sentry's horn echoed from the high cliffs. It was a sound of alarm. Everyone froze. Ilara, who was speaking with a group of weavers, sprinted to the base of the cliff and looked up. Caleb followed, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. On the high ledge near the entrance, the very path they had used to enter, stood a figure. Even from this distance, the silhouette was unmistakable. It was Silas Blackwood, and he was not alone. Behind him, more figures appeared, at least a dozen men, armed with rifles. Hank was among them, looking down into the valley like a man staring at a chest of gold. They had somehow tracked them. Perhaps they found Colt, or perhaps Blackwood's obsessive cunning had simply been enough. A wave of despair washed over the valley. Their sanctuary, hidden for generations, had been found. The serpent had entered the garden. Blackwood's voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the valley, boomed down at them. "Princess Ilara, a magnificent hiding place. Thank you for showing me the way," he yelled, his voice dripping with triumphant mockery. "Send up the artifacts, the gold, everything of value, and we might just let you live in your little paradise. Refuse, and we will come down, and take it, and we will burn what we cannot carry." Panic began to ripple through the Awani. They were a peaceful people, not warriors trained for battle against men with rifles. But Ilara's voice cut through the fear, clear and strong. "This is our home," she shouted back up at the cliffs. "We will not surrender it to thieves and grave robbers." She turned to her people, her eyes blazing. "We know this valley. They do not. Every rock, every cave, every trail is our ally. We will not fight them on their terms. We will fight them on ours." She looked at Caleb, and in her eyes, he saw not a plea for help, but an invitation to stand with them. His debt was paid, his promise to her father fulfilled. He could have tried to flee, to save himself. But looking at the terrified faces of the Awani and the quiet strength of their princess, he knew his journey was not over. His atonement wasn't about repaying a ghost from his past. It was about defending the future of these people. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking echoing in the sudden silence. He was no longer just a cowboy. He was a guardian of the garden, and he would stand with them until the very end. The final battle for Awani had begun. The sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley. Blackwood and his men, silhouetted against the blood-red sky, were confident. They held the high ground, the only known entrance, and they had the superior firepower. To them, it was not a battle, but an extermination and a treasure hunt. They did not know they were already in a trap. While Blackwood's men made camp on the ledge, preparing for a morning assault, Ilara gathered her people in the main plaza. She was not a general planning a war, but a leader harnessing the very soul of her home. "They stand on a cliff," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "But we are the valley. They have rifles. But we have the mountain. Every cave is a hiding place. Every trail is a weapon. Her plan was brilliant in its simplicity. They would not engage in a direct fight. They would use their intimate knowledge of Awani to turn the valley itself against the invaders. She divided the strongest men and women into small groups. One group was sent to the high waterfalls, to a place where a series of precariously balanced logs, used for generations to divert water for irrigation, could be released to create a flash flood down a narrow canyon, one of the few accessible paths from the ledge. Another group, armed with bows and knowledge of powerful natural toxins, prepared poisoned arrows, not necessarily to kill, but to injure and incapacitate. A third group was tasked with creating diversions, using echoes and hidden paths to make their small number seem like a legion. Caleb watched her, filled with awe. He was a fighter, a man of direct action, but her strategy was that of a chess master. She had given him a single, crucial task. "You know him," she said, her dark eyes locking with his. "You know Silas. He will not stay with his men. His greed will make him reckless. He will come for the story stones himself. You must be the one to face him." It was a princess's gambit, trusting her people to defend their home while entrusting her cowboy to slay the dragon. As night fell, the Awani's war began. A volley of arrows flew from the darkness, striking 2 of Blackwood's sentries. The men cried out, more in shock than pain, as the poison began its work, causing paralysis and confusion. The invaders opened fire into the darkness, their bullets ricocheting uselessly off the granite walls. From another direction, a war cry, echoed by the canyon walls, made it sound as if 100 warriors were charging. Chaos and fear began to erode the confidence of Blackwood's men. As Alara predicted, Blackwood grew impatient. He left Hank in charge of the main force, and with his 3 most ruthless gunmen, he began his descent into the valley, using ropes to navigate a steep game trail. He was heading directly for the plaza and the story stones, and Caleb was waiting, hidden in the shadows of a dwelling carved from rock. He watched them approach. This was his moment, the culmination of his long, painful journey. He let the 3 gunmen pass, then stepped out behind them, his pistol leveled. "That's far enough, Silas." Blackwood spun around, a snarl on his face. "The ghost of failure's past. I should have killed you in that smithy." "You should have stayed out of this valley," Caleb retorted. The duel he had been running from his entire adult life was finally here. Not a fight for money or pride, but for redemption. The 3 gunmen turned, but Caleb was ready. He fired twice, his shots precise and economical. 1 man fell. The other clutched a shattered shoulder. The third hesitated, and that was enough. Caleb was on him, not with a gun, but with the brutal efficiency of a man who knew how to survive. A blow to the throat, a twist of an arm, and the third man was disarmed and incapacitated. Now it was just him and Blackwood. The bounty hunter was fast, firing his pistol, forcing Caleb to dive behind one of the sacred story stones. The stone, carved with the image of a great eagle, chipped as a bullet struck it. A wave of cold fury washed over Caleb. This was the desecration he had sworn to prevent. He came out from behind the stone, not firing, but charging. He tackled Blackwood, and the 2 men crashed to the ground, their pistols skittering away into the darkness. It became a primal, brutal fight. Fists and feet, teeth and nails. Blackwood was strong, fueled by rage and greed. But Caleb was fueled by something more powerful, atonement. He fought for Kenai, for Ilara, for the peaceful people of the valley, and for the broken soldier boy he had once been. As they wrestled on the ground, Caleb's hand closed around a smooth, heavy rock, a river stone, perhaps placed there by an Awani child. He brought it down with all his strength on Blackwood's temple. The man went limp. The fight was over. At that moment, a great roar echoed through the valley. Ilara's signal. The logs at the waterfall had been released. A torrent of water and rock crashed down the canyon path, sweeping away the rest of Blackwood's men. Their greedy invasion washed away by the very power of the valley they sought to plunder. Silence descended. A profound, sacred silence. Caleb stood over Blackwood's still form, his chest heaving, his body bruised and battered. Ilara and her people emerged from the shadows. She walked to him, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes shining with tears and triumph. She looked not at Blackwood, but at Caleb. She placed her hand on the story stone he had protected, then reached out and gently touched the bruises on his face. No words were needed. In the heart of the hidden valley, a princess had saved her people, and a cowboy had finally, truly, found his peace. His atonement was complete, paid not in blood, but in the defense of life. Two worlds had collided, and in the aftermath of the storm, a new one, born of courage and compassion, could begin. The days that followed the battle were quiet. The valley of Awani healed itself, absorbing the brief, violent intrusion as a great mountain absorbs a storm, leaving it strong and unchanged. The few survivors of Blackwood's party, including Hank, were rounded up. They were not killed. In a council led by Ilara and the elders, they were given supplies and escorted to the edge of Awani territory, with a solemn warning never to return. Their memories of the valley's exact location already fading into a confusing nightmare of rock and water. Their punishment was not death, but the burden of their own shame, a mercy they could never have understood. Caleb healed, his broken ribs mending, his spirit settling into a tranquility he had never known. He worked alongside the Awani, helping to repair the small damages from the fight, learning their ways, their language, their stories. He was no longer an outsider. He was Koda, the name the children gave him, meaning friend. He would often sit by the river with Ilara, not speaking, simply sharing the silence, watching the water flow. The terrible debt that had haunted him for years had been paid in full, replaced by a bond of love and respect that needed no words. He had found his home, not in a place, but with a people. His past was not erased, but integrated. The scars remained, but they no longer ached with guilt. They were a part of his story, a map of the journey that had led him here, to this moment of grace. Ilara, now the undisputed leader of her people, guided them with a wisdom that blended ancient tradition with a new understanding of the world outside. She knew they could not remain hidden forever, but they would face the future on their own terms, strong and unbroken. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the granite peaks in hues of rose and gold, Ilara gave Caleb a small, smooth stone from the riverbed. It was featureless, yet held the weight of a promise. "Our story is now on the stones," she said softly. "The story of the cowboy who kept his promise." In that moment, Caleb understood that redemption wasn't a destination one arrives at, but a path one chooses to walk every day. And here, in this sacred garden, surrounded by the quiet strength of the Awani and the love of their princess, his long, lonely walk was finally over. He had found his peace,